on Off the Ball.
With Vodafone, official sponsors of the Irish rugby team. Team of us. Everyone in.
I don't think Murrayfield has ever buzzed with the same air of feverish anticipation as at this very moment, as one of the great sporting occasions is about to unfold. And here, Will Carling leads on the England side with their tremendous record of having scored 11 tries to 2 in the championship so far in the 3 matches, and some great cheering and some good nature going as well as England take the field.
I'm sure in 1990 that was the very first year in which Flower of Scotland was sung, and in 1990 I think it really sort of was so appropriate and so apt for that occasion.
This one could be a very important kick, because just before half-time the Scots will feel that they need a bigger lead than just 2 points. Chalmers then. Oh, he's done it once more. I mean, it looked so inebriated as it went over. You would have thought it would have keeled over, but he's done it. 3 penalty goals for Craig Chalmers. Scotland 9-4 ahead. They've played 36 minutes and the crowd are delighted. Out to Andrew. Andrew there to Carling. Carling beautifully tackled by Jeffrey. Taken on by Bailey. Bailey on to Tegan Winterbottom. The referee's whistle goes for the end of the game. And Scotland have won a famous victory. One of the unique occasions in rugby union football. And Scotland have won by 13 points to 7. And the scenes of euphoria here, well, just look at them.
Yeah, extraordinary stuff. Bill McLaren there at his very best. 30 years ago at Murrayfield, Scotland against England, a Grand Slam decider, and the Scots famously prevailed. You would have heard Gavin Hastings' voice in there as well. To discuss with England going back to Murrayfield this weekend, we have Tom English on the line, BBC Scotland, and author of The Grudge as well. Back, I think, Tom, 10 years ago, presumably on the 20th anniversary, and now we've updated it.
Yeah, that's right, Joe, yeah. First edition came out in 2010, and the latest edition came out just at the end of last month, a few days ago.
Bill McLaren there referring to some good-natured booing.
I think you could have 15 players boxing the head off each other back in those days, and Bill McLaren would call it a minor schmozzle. I think there wasn't a lot of good-natured stuff about it that day. When you've talked to Brian Moore and Will Carling, they will say very little about it was good-natured.
It's extraordinary stuff. So I was watching it back today, various aspects of the game. Even to pick up on the very end point we heard there, the full-time whistle. It was jarring for me, I guess, for anyone of kind of my generation in particular, to see the full-time whistle go. Now, I was 5 when it happened, so I'm probably of that generation too. But it was incredibly jarring to watch the full-time whistle go, and at this moment of complete euphoria, the Scottish players just started sprinting, not towards each other, but towards the tunnel to get the hell off the pitch, because they knew the invasion was coming. And so you had 1 or 2 still trapped out there. I think David Sowell was trapped out there. Yeah. But so they all get into the tunnel, and that's where, you know, we know the traditional clap off of the opposition. That's where they clap off the English team, in the tunnel. It's just this kind of amazing moment that they all, you know, full-time whistle, greatest moment of their sporting lives, and it's a run to try and save their lives.
A totally different era. You know, a kind of very innocent era in many ways. I'm sure the Scottish players would love to have walked around the Murrayfield pitch and kind of drinking in the applause of the Scottish fans, but it was for a lot of those Scottish fans, it was more than just a rugby match. You know, this was almost like a cultural event, given a lot of the backdrop. Scotland was a very, very kind of incendiary place at the time. You know, Scottish nationalism was on the rise, as it is now. You know, history is kind of repeating itself.
Was Scottish nationalism at that point about independence, or was it about something less defined?
There was obviously an awful lot of talk about Scotland should be an independent country, but what it was mostly about was Margaret Thatcher's, what the Scots saw as her kind of ruthless rule of Scotland, her disregard for Scottish feeling, her running down of Scottish industries, her lecturing and her hectoring of Scotland as Scotland's economy went down the pan, mass unemployment, She didn't seem to care. She got this moniker of that bloody woman in Scotland. And she didn't see the point. She kept on coming to Scotland. She thought that Scotland would eventually be won over by her policies. She never really got Scotland. Eventually, she started in a kind of desperate and ill-conceived attempt to ingratiate herself with Scottish people. She started saying "we in Scotland" and "us in Scotland," and it just grated. It just acted like a red rag to the Scottish bull, because they said, "You're not one of us. You never will be." So it was always doomed to failure with Margaret Thatcher and the Scots.
And the poll tax, one of her more controversial policies, as I understand it, that was tried out, effectively experimented with in Scotland first.
Yeah, and she needed that was 1989. It was trialled in Scotland, and it was trialled in Scotland first. But it was tried. You know, this is the irony of this: is the poll tax was created by a Scot, and it was implemented in Scotland by the Scotland Office in Westminster, who persuaded Thatcher to try it out in Scotland first. These were Scots persuading Thatcher to try this out because they thought genuinely it was a vote winner. Shows you how out of touch they were. I mean, completely divorced from what Scottish feeling was like. She was a bit hesitant because she thought this could be controversial. It might go down badly. It might look like the Tories were using Scotland as some kind of as an experiment. And sure enough, that's the way it turned out. And it went down. And it was the poll tax, I think, was the end of Margaret Thatcher. But again, the Scots say when it came into Scotland first, the English didn't really care. You know, there was mayhem in Scotland. It was only when the poll tax was introduced into England in 1990 did the newspapers care, did the English people care. They didn't care for a year that it was implemented in Scotland. You know, it's almost, again, the Scots, their feelings were discounted.
John Jeffrey, I mean, another subplot, I suppose. Look, there's always going to be a rivalry between England and Scotland. John Jeffrey, the Scottish flanker, he had said, you know, in his opinion, maybe that some of the atmosphere, the ill feeling was traced back to the streets of Glasgow. Was it 7 months earlier? There was a match at Hampden Park. There was serious violence there between supporters. Yeah,
it was JJ's theory that, you know, Scotland, the football match, which had gone on for 100 years, annual football match between Scotland and England, it had been abandoned the previous year because of pitched battles on the streets of Glasgow. And now the annual sporting fix for Scotland against England was the rugby match. So the tabloid press started to get interested in it. And rugby achieved a profile in Scotland that it never had before, because leading up to that match, because not just because it was a Grand Slam game, but it was a Grand Slam game between Scotland and England. People who would normally be interested in rugby started to get interested in it because it was Scotland v England. And we're not talking here about, you know, football hooligans. We're just talking about people who had a grievance against being ruled from England. Remember, the Tories had very little support in the general elections. It was a general election in 1987, and the Tory vote collapsed in Scotland, and yet the Tories were telling the Scots what to do. So Flower of Scotland was introduced as an anthem in 1990, which was very, very interesting because the SRU, the Scottish Rugby Union, was an incredibly conservative body that had Princess Anne as its patron. Up to 1990, the national anthem was God Save the Queen. And they had numerous options when they decided to change it, because God Save the Queen started to be booed at Murrayfield, and it became very embarrassing for the SRU. Princess Anne sitting in the stand and everyone booing her mother. So they decided to change it. Now, they had numerous options, safe options. You know, Scotland the Brave, which was the one that the football team were using. Scots Way Hey, a play on a Rabbie Burns poem. There was Caledonia. There was numerous other options, all safe. They picked the most contentious one of all. This very conservative body of men on the SRU committee picked Flower of Scotland, which was a very kind of, you know, up and at 'em anthem, and so untypical. But it was reflective of the time, I think, that even this growing sense of Scottish pride and Scottish belligerence against England had affected the committee men at Murrayfield.
Okay, because that was one of the questions we mentioned earlier on. You were coming on, you know, and somebody asked, well, why Flower of Scotland? Was that like the Fields of Athenry? Did everybody know that? But so there was that very deliberate choice. It's about Scotland's victory at Bannockburn. It does, you know, we see them sing the line with gusto and send them home to think again. You know, the English, back you go before you come up here again. So that's no fluke. That's no mistake. That was of the time, that period.
Definitely. I mean, John Jeffrey, the great flanker of that team, he used to sing it at all Scottish games. Even when God Save the Queen was their anthem, he used to sing Flower of Scotland while God Save the Queen was playing, because he's found it more rousing. Nothing against the Queen or the royal family or even England. He just found Flower of Scotland a more inspiring anthem for him, a proud Borders farmer who wanted to feel something that got the juices flowing. And that's the one they sang on the team bus going to matches. So it had a resonance. This isn't an age-old song. This was a song that was created by a folk band called the Corries in the 1960s.
Right.
So it's relatively new.
Okay. To the match itself, I mean, there's loads of interesting aspects here. This is Scotland's third ever Grand Slam we're talking about. A Grand Slam decider. But two teams have arrived at this point in very different ways. The Scots, you know, have kind of squeezed past Ireland, I think, by 3 points. They've squeezed past the Welsh by 4 points. The England turn up 11 tries, 4-2 against. They are the team to be beaten. They're dominant up front. They're scoring tries. They're a brilliant team. They are the firm favourites here, Tom.
They are, yeah. This is one of the great England teams we're talking about. And you think 11 tries in 3 matches leading up to the Grand Slam game. It doesn't seem much in the modern era. But back then, it was a huge amount of scores. And their pack was dominant, led by Brian Moore. Their back line was extraordinary, led by Jeremy Guscott and Will Carling, the young captain. They looked invincible. They humiliated France in France. They humiliated Wales. They hammered Ireland, and they were hot favourites to beat Scotland. As you say, Scotland had won 3, but they were kind of limping along. And they were huge underdogs, even though the game was in Edinburgh.
I think it was Gavin Hastings in a documentary piece about it said as well that the Scots never talk to the media in the build-up to the game. They let the English do that. They let the story be about England's brilliance, and they allowed themselves really grasp the underdogs title. And then talk to us about the walkout, because that's very famous as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think all of that. I think that the players got together and the management, and like, you know, your Scotland team is coached by Ian McGeechan and Jim Telfer.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, two of the greats.
Yeah.
And Telfer particularly love-bombed the England players beforehand. I said this, the forward pack, you'd never seen anything like it. You know, they looked like they're unbeatable. Hammed it up to a ridiculous degree. And I think a lot of the English players bought it. And he saw weaknesses, and McGeechan saw weaknesses in this team, and he said they saw them around Will Carling's leadership, a very young captain, quite uncertain of himself. They didn't know how uncertain of himself he actually was at the time, but they recognised weakness in there. And they dreamed up this slow march. They wanted something that made a statement, that engaged the crowd. They didn't want to run onto the field like a million miles an hour like all teams did. They decided to walk out. And this has become a storied walk. And the narrative of the time was that, you know, David Soul led his players out, and the crowd rose and the noise level rose and rose to this crescendo, and that England players looked over and absolutely lost their bottle completely. The vast majority of the England players didn't notice the slow walk. They were just too wrapped up in themselves. They were running around the pitch. They didn't notice. They noticed the increased volume of the crowd, but they didn't notice the walkout. The thing that really kind of troubled England was Flower of Scotland. All of a sudden, you had these Scots singing their anthem. They'd never seen the Scots sing their anthem before, really. God Save the Queen. They weren't into it that much. But this anthem was something like they'd never heard before. And that, I think, even in the likes of Mick Skinner, who would have been full of himself, let's face it, he was going, oh my God, the Scots are singing. We're in trouble now.
Okay, really? Because I know for your book here, we're talking about The Grudge. You've talked, I mean, a bit like your other books where you've got an oral history from different people involved. You talked to various players about this, so that's interesting to hear that about the anthem. You mentioned Will Carling there, very young captain, and you wouldn't think now he has confidence issues for sure, but a young captain finding his feet. Brian Moore certainly had his eye on that captaincy. Was there friction there? Was that an issue in the English team?
Oh yeah, considerable friction there, yeah, huge. Brian Moore thought he should be captain, and he thought he would be captain, but he wasn't given it. Will Carling was given it at a very young age, early 20s, and there was an awful lot of tension between them. I mean, Carling was like, you think about Carling, he was packed off to boarding school at the age of 7. He said that he cried himself to sleep at his early days in boarding school. He went to secondary boarding school in the middle of the Yorkshire Dales, again cried himself to sleep, and he said he had to learn to put up a mask to survive. He had to get through the day, those early days, weeks, months, maybe even years, by pretending to be big, tough character. And that carried on into his rugby. And it carried on to into his England captaincy, the early days of his England captaincy. He said he wasn't self-confident at all. He was very, very fearful, totally lacking in self-confidence. And he said, he idolised the Peter Winterbottom, particularly the back row forward of that England team. And he used to go up to Peter Winterbottom in those early days, 89, 90, and he used to ask Winterbottom, this legend, says, Peter, how do you think I played today? And Peter Winterbottom, this gnarled old rugby player, would say, what are you asking me that for? Just get a grip yourself, bugger off. So he was kind of trapped. He needed reassurance, and he was never getting it from that real kind of macho culture that he was in. It was funny. I wasn't going to do the book unless Will Carling and Brian Moore spoke to me, because those two were most deeply affected of the England players by the anti-Englishness that was in Scotland that week. But thankfully, both of them spoke to me, and both of them were fantastic. But it was Keith Wood who set up the Will Carling interview for me, because I didn't know Will at all. And he said, and sure enough, he set it up. And I remember Keith saying to me, give me a ring after you've spoken to him and tell me what you think of him. And I was staggered, because I thought I'd go down there and I'd see this preening Will Carling of newspaper and television fame. And I found a completely different person. A guy who was incredibly self-aware, self-critical, honest. And I rang Keith and he said, what did you think of him? I said, I don't know if he was playing me here, but I found a kind of incredibly honest but hugely insecure guy. And he says, that's exactly who he was, and possibly who he still was at that time. Throughout his playing career, he was insecure, never knew whether he was good enough. But he had to put up a mask like he did as a 7-year-old boy in school. Wow,
that's fascinating. I wouldn't have thought Brian Moore would have been in any way rattled by the anti-Englishness.
I would say, I think he was rattled by it and maybe inspired by it.
Okay.
He said it wasn't far from hatred. Now, I have to say that a good number of the other England players never noticed any anti-Englishness. Paul Ackford didn't notice any anti-Englishness, for example. But Brian Moore certainly did. And I suppose as a kind of totem, one of the totems of the team, he was going to get it. And Will Carling was going to get it, because the Scottish media had turned Will Carling into this, Thatcher's representation in the England team. He was nothing like that. Will Carling had no interest in politics at all, had never voted in his life. And neither did Brian Moore. Brian Moore would never have voted for the Tories, that's for sure.
Yeah, he was against the poll tax, wasn't he?
Totally against the poll tax. And he said if he was Scottish, he'd be out in the streets protesting against the poll tax. And actually says in the new edition, I've gone back and interviewed him, and he says in the new edition of the book that if he was Scottish, he'd be voting for independence. So he's a very, very complex character, Brian. He was adopted at 2 weeks, constantly fighting with people, constantly angry and driven, and as we found out subsequently, and he says it explains quite a bit about the way his life went. He was sexually abused at the age of 9, and that has he's come to terms with that over the years, and I think a lot of the new material that I did with Brian for the new book is all around what happened to him when he was just a little boy.
Yeah, no, he's an incredible fella. The game itself, 13-7, I've never watched the full 80 minutes back. Was it a good game?
Mayhem.
Was it enthralling?
Mayhem.
Mayhem.
If you looked at it, you'd laugh,
Yeah.
Joe. You'd laugh.
Well, I enjoyed a few of the line-outs, I must say.
Oh, the lineouts were just a free-for-all. It was relentless. You know, it was physically, it was brutal. I mean, and Telfer wanted to be brutal. And he thought, look, if we make this a brutal game of rugby, we'll win it. Because, you know, as he said to his forwards, you know, I have trained you to within an inch of your lives. And you will go to places where these English forwards won't go. I mean, Telfer, you know, again, one of the most compelling characters I have ever interviewed in my career. You know, a socialist at the age of 8, he said. A guy who grew up hating privilege because his mother was a servant in the local duke's house, and his father was a shepherd for the local duke, and he spent his entire life wondering how some people had so much and some people had so little. So he turned that, what was a very moderate pack of forwards, into this incredibly well-drilled force that were just inspired by, I suppose, by Finlay Calder, by John Jeffrey, by Derek White, by David Soul, the captain. And England really found it very hard, even though England, man for man, were far more talented. They couldn't live with that Scottish intensity.
Yeah, an extraordinary array of characters. Like, we haven't mentioned McGeechan, you know, legendary figure, and Telfer. Telfer, that was his 50th birthday that day, by the way, Telfer. We had him on the radio about a year ago, and he's like sharp as a tack, so, you know, there you go.
Well, I mean, I went to see him. I go and see him quite often because I just love his company, and he's still massively into rugby. He'll still watch club rugby in South Africa. He'll watch under 20s in New Zealand. He'll watch anything bit of rugby that's on the telly, and he'll be 80 on St. Patrick's Day. But he's big into flowers now. He's got massive into flowers. His garden is like the Chelsea Flower Show. And when I was down there, he said, you know, I've won the Gala Shields Small Garden of the Year award 3 years in a row. And I says, oh, geez, will you win it 4 years? And he says, I'm not sure. He says, come with me. So we went to the front door of his house, and he pointed down the street to a beautiful garden full of really colourful flowers. And he says, that's my danger. So he still has that bit of madness in him. Each was inspired. I mean, the whole Geach story was to do with his father. His father died of cancer when Geach was 48. So he never saw Geach play for Scotland. He never saw Geach coach for Scotland. But everything that Geach did was for his father. Everything.
Right. Fairly fascinating bunch of men, actually, when you pick your way through them for the book. Yeah,
absolutely. You know, there's a I mean, there's so many. I mean, I spoke to all of them, and you know, you're not even talking about the Hastings brothers. You're not talking about Mick Skinner or Mike Teague, Iron Mike, Wade Dooley. You know, there's so many interesting characters with interesting stories, and all of them, you know, so happy to talk. You know, again, you talk about the pitch invasion and how rugby has changed. Rugby has changed in so many different ways, and the fact that I can go and spend hours with these guys talking with brutal honesty, many of them, that has kind of changed as well.
Yeah. Well, listen, the book, the updated version of The Grudge, is out now, Tom. I must say I'm going to go and get a look at it, because everything I've seen of it looks fantastic. So
cheers.
It's available now, The Grudge. And, well, we'll see what happens this weekend. If you see Stuart Hogg, tell him thanks very much, will you?
I think I might leave that a few weeks, will I?
Yeah. I presume I presume
I
on some...
see him today.
Oh, did you?
Today.
Yeah.
I didn't approach.
Okay.
I left him to it.
Oh, Gregor Townsend might never admit it, but they would have taken a close run thing at the Aviva Stadium, you know, given the current circumstances beforehand.
Yeah, I thought Scotland would lose by 20. So I'm kind of happy with my Scottish hat on, if I'm allowed to have a Scottish hat on,
You are, yeah.
that they fronted up at least. They fronted up big style. And I think they probably should have won the game, but you don't take your chances. You don't win too many games at this level. And Scotland, unfortunately, had the habit of that.
They do. The clock is coming against us, Tom. Thanks so much for your time. Much appreciated.
Pleasure, Joe. Anytime.
Cheers. That's Tom English there talking about his book, The Grudge, updated 30 years on from that day in Murrayfield. And obviously works with BBC Scotland as well. Next up, we're going to be talking to Conor Nyland about the Australian Open. And I should let you know, in the FA Cup, still 0-0 between Liverpool and Shrewsbury Town. Newcastle are 1-0 up away to Oxford United.
Off the ball on News Talk.
At Lexus, we have always anticipated the future, relentlessly pushing the boundaries of beautiful